The room shimmered with gold light and polished silver. Someone's laugh cracked through the air, too bright, too sharp. I watched a thick envelope slide across the table, my sister's hand trembling as she opened it. Gasps, then applause. The words Lake House and 350,000 floated like confetti. My glass stayed untouched. Then another envelope, thin, plain, was placed in front of me. Every sound disappeared. Eyes turned. "Go on," someone said softly. I opened it. Paper rustled once. Whatever was written inside made her smile freeze before I even finished the first line. I was 9 the first time I understood how the air in our house worked. Praise moved in one direction. It floated toward my sister, warm and endless, while the rest of us breathed what was left. She came home with perfect grades, trophies, certificates. I came home with drawings on lined paper. Mom smiled at mine, then set them aside so she could frame hers. Dad said I was steady, the kind of word people used when they had nothing better. At family dinners, my sister's stories filled the table. Mine ended before they began. I learned to cut my food quietly to wait for a pause that never came. When she got into college, we celebrated for days. When I passed my nursing exam, Mom said, "That's nice, honey," without looking up from her phone. It wasn't cruelty, it was muscle memory. Everyone had their part. Mine was to notice the silence. Holidays followed the same choreography, her entrance, everyone rising the room, orbiting her brightness. She once said I was so calm, it's like you're not even here. I laughed because that's what was expected. In photos, I stood just off center, half in shadow, half invisible. The pattern deepened with time. When her engagement was announced, I helped pick the dress, the flowers, the playlist. When mine was, she cried in the bathroom. Mom followed door, closing behind them. I remember staring at the gravy cooling on my plate, the sound of muffled sobs, the whisper of comfort that wasn't for me, later Mom's hand on my shoulder. "Let's keep the wedding small, sweetheart, just to keep things peaceful." Peaceful. That word had weight. It meant quiet. It meant don't upset her. After that, I stopped trying to fit noise into spaces already claimed. I worked, saved, built my own routine. Breathing counted. Folding laundry counted, silence counted. When people asked about family, I said we were close. It was easier than explaining the distance measured in tone, not miles. The last time I visited before that Christmas, I brought homemade cookies from the hospital kitchen. Charlotte said she couldn't eat sugar that week, some cleanse. Mom took them anyway and set them next to the untouched fruitcake Charlotte liked. I remember thinking the table looked like a museum of things she might want later. That night, lying in my studio above the Chinese restaurant, I heard the clatter of pans, the hiss of oil below. I counted my breaths until the ceiling stopped shaking. The smell of sesame and detergent mixed in the air. That was when I realized the truth. My silence wasn't patience. It was training. Every skipped word, every unfinished sentence had been rehearsal for something larger. I just didn't know yet what I'd need it for. By the next winter, the pattern had turned into choreography. Every visit home began the same way, her laughter filling the hallway before she even stepped inside. Mom's perfume already on her coat, Dad rushing to open wine. My arrival was quieter. A coat hung by the door, a hello that disappeared into conversation already happening. Charlotte talked about her campaigns, her clients, her new office. Dad called her our superstar. When I mentioned a patient who'd recovered after a long coma, Mom smiled politely and reached for the salt. I learned to measure affection in eye contact. 3 seconds was a miracle. 5 meant someone had remembered I existed. When she and Ethan announced they were trying for a baby, the house became a shrine to hope. Ultrasound magnets, fertility calendars on the fridge, scented candles that claimed to balance energy. Every conversation circled the same theme: patience, prayer, waiting. I was careful with my words, afraid even a hint of joy might sound like gloating. But the months turned into years, and the waiting became bitterness. She started skipping gatherings, claiming she couldn't stand to see normal families. Mom would defend her. She's just sensitive. I would nod, knowing sensitive was the family's way of saying dangerous. When James and I got engaged, Charlotte cried again. Not soft tears, sobbing, trembling, leaving the table mid-meal. Mom and Dad followed, leaving me and James with cold plates and the hum of the refrigerator. "It's fine," I whispered, even though it wasn't. We planned a small wedding just like they wanted. Charlotte was my maid of honor, a title she wore like a burden. She showed up an hour late to the bachelorette dinner, left after one drink, and gave a toast at the reception that began with, "It's been such a hard year for me." People clapped. I smiled for photos, eyes dry, fingers pressed into my bouquet until the stems bruised. After the wedding, the imbalance deepened. Charlotte started making small comments. "You've always had it easier, Piper. You wouldn't understand." Easier. The word stuck to me like static. I wanted to tell her about the double shifts, the missed meals, the quiet tears after long nights at the hospital, but what was the point? Any truth that didn't center her became noise. When I finally got pregnant 7 months later, I kept it secret for a while. I knew what would happen. And when I did tell them, it played out exactly as I'd feared. Charlotte's face drained of color, then flushed red. She accused me of cruelty, of timing it to hurt her. Mom sat frozen. Dad stared at his plate. I stood there holding the ultrasound photo, realizing my family could watch me be humiliated and still call it keeping peace. A week later, I miscarried. The house stayed silent. No flowers, no call from my sister. When Mom finally reached out, she repeated Charlotte's words as if they were scripture. Maybe it was the universe's lesson not to take things for granted. I stopped answering her texts after that, not out of anger, but clarity. The message was simple. My pain didn't count unless it made someone else feel better. That was the moment something in me went still. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the kind of silence you keep before a storm. By the next spring, we spoke only through group texts. My parents sent cheerful reminders about Sunday dinners, attaching photos of the table as if proof of harmony could fix what was broken. I replied with polite excuses, night shift, early rounds, chart backlog. Half were true. Most were self-preservation. When we did show up, the air felt managed. Mom planned menus that avoided triggers. No talk of babies, no stories about work, no jokes that might make Charlotte uncomfortable. James would squeeze my hand under the table, our secret Morse code for hold still. We lasted through birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, each gathering quieter than the last. Then Easter came. My aunt mentioned her daughter's engagement, and I watched it happen, the small shift in Charlotte's face, the tight smile, the silence spreading like spilled wine. 10 minutes later, she was gone, crying in the bathroom, the same script as always. The room rearranged itself around her absence. My aunt looked embarrassed, her daughter's engagement gone erased. I caught James's eye. He didn't speak until we were in the car. "This is insane," he said. "One person decides when everyone's allowed to be happy." I didn't argue. I was too tired. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion had replaced anger. I just wanted distance enough space to hear myself think. So we began to disappear, one skipped dinner, then another. Mom noticed. "It feels like you're punishing us," she said over the phone. I wanted to tell her I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just done playing a role in a play that never changed acts. By December, our absences had become an event in themselves. Mom called 3 days before Christmas Eve, her voice tremoring with hope. "Please come this year. It would mean so much to your sister." My first instinct was no. Then James said quietly, "Maybe it's time to stop running from the noise." I didn't know if he meant confrontation or closure. Maybe both. So we went. The house glittered when we arrived, garland candles, the smell of roast and cinnamon. Charlotte greeted us with a smile too bright to be real. For the first hour, everything seemed rehearsed. She asked about my job. I asked about her latest project. Mom kept refilling glasses. Dad laughed louder than usual. Dinner came and went, and then Dad stood clearing his throat. "We have something special for you two this year." Mom disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a large envelope. She handed it to Charlotte. The room leaned forward as she opened it. Gasps applause, the word lake house. Charlotte cried beautiful tears that caught the candlelight. "It's the cabin," she whispered. "They bought us the cabin." I felt James's hand find mine under the table. I smiled because that's what you do when history repeats. Then Dad said, "And we have something for you too, Piper." Mom reached under the tree and pulled out a smaller envelope, thin plain white. She placed it in front of me with the same smile people give children before a trick. "Go ahead," she said. The room quieted. My pulse matched the clock on the wall. I opened it. Inside, a folded letter written in my mother's looping handwriting. "Read it aloud," Dad said. "We want everyone to hear." I looked up, unsure if this was another setup or something else entirely. Charlotte's smile held steady, confident, radiant. I took a breath, flattened the paper, and began to read. "Dear Piper and James," I began. My voice trembled once, then steadied. "We've watched you work hard for everything you have, and we're proud of the adults you've become." The room stayed still. Charlotte's smile faltered just slightly. I kept reading. "Piper, your dedication to your patients, your strength through difficult times, and the grace you've shown even when others failed to show you the same have reminded us what real character looks like." Mom's eyes glistened, but it wasn't sadness. It was recognition, the kind that comes too late. "James," I continued, "you've stood by her quietly, steadily through years of imbalance that we now realize we allowed to grow unchecked." The silence shifted heavier now. Charlotte's hand froze halfway to her glass. I read the next line slower. "We know you've been saving to buy your first home, and we want to give you what we should have years ago." My throat tightened. I could feel Charlotte watching me. "We're giving you $45,000 toward your first house," I said, "and covering the remainder of your student loans." The air cracked. Charlotte's face turned the color of ash. Ethan looked down at his plate. James exhaled softly beside me, a sound that was half relief, half disbelief. "This is not a loan," I read. "It's not charity. It's acknowledgement for the times you were treated unfairly and stayed silent to keep the peace." Charlotte's fork slipped and clattered against her plate. The sound felt like punctuation. I kept my eyes on the letter. "We're tired of pretending this dynamic is normal. We love both our daughters, but we can't keep enabling behavior that hurts one to soothe the other." When I looked up, Charlotte was staring at me, her expression raw anger, shame, disbelief tangled together. "You planned this," she said finally, her voice low but trembling. "I didn't," I said, folding the letter once. "They did." "This is humiliating," she snapped, standing up. "You made me look like the villain in front of everyone." Dad's tone was calm, almost clinical. "No one made you anything. We wrote down the truth." Charlotte turned to me. "You must be proud of yourself. You finally got your revenge." I set the letter down. "If that's what this feels like, maybe that says more about you than me." James stood, voice even but firm. "For years you've treated her like her existence was a threat. That ends tonight." Charlotte's lip quivered. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly," he said. "And so does everyone else now." Ethan spoke next, soft but steady. "Charlotte, enough." Her shoulders dropped. For the first time, she looked small, like someone who'd run out of scripts. Mom's voice broke the silence. "We love you, honey, but this family can't keep orbiting one person's feelings." Charlotte pressed her palms to her eyes. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. Dad leaned forward. "Then start by listening." The only sound was the fire crackling behind us. I reached for the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table between us. "This isn't about punishment," I said quietly. "It's about balance." For a moment, no one moved. Then Charlotte sank back into her chair, eyes wet but no longer defiant. The fire popped once, releasing a spark that drifted upward and vanished. Outside, snow began to fall against the window, soft, steady, soundless. No one spoke again. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. The days after Christmas passed like slow breath. The letter stayed on my nightstand, folded once edges soft from my fingers. I didn't reread it, but I didn't put it away either. It wasn't just paper, it was proof that the silence had finally spoken. Charlotte called a week later. Her voice was thin, unfamiliar. She said she was starting therapy, that Ethan was helping her find someone local. There was no grand apology, no script, just quiet. I told her I hoped it helped, and I meant it. By spring, James and I closed on a small house on the edge of town, white siding, narrow porch, 2 rooms that smelled faintly of paint and promise. The day we got the keys, I stood in the empty living room, hearing the echo of my own footsteps. For once, no one else's voice filled the space. Mom and Dad visited a few weeks later. They brought a potted fern and left before sunset. There were no speeches, no long looks, only a warmth that didn't need explanation. That night, I found the letter again, tucked it into a drawer, and watched the light fade through the curtains. Somewhere far away, I imagined the lake house, too. The water still untouched, holding its own reflection. Maybe one day we'd meet there again in some quieter version of family. For now, the world had gone still enough for me to hear the hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of my own breathing, the smallest sounds of a life that finally belonged to me. Some people think revenge means winning louder. It doesn't. Sometimes it's the sound of a page folding a breath, slowing a door closing softly behind you. That night, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just read the truth and let it land where it needed to. Peace doesn't arrive with applause, it settles like snow covering what's been said, softening the ground so you can finally walk forward. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace, remember this: silence can build walls, but it can also build strength. Thanks for watching my story. Tell me in the comments what moment finally made you stop apologizing for being the calm one. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, where justice isn't loud, but it lasts. I was making coffee in my Seattle apartment when my phone buzzed. A short text from my mother lit up the screen. "This year, just your sister's family." No explanation, no invitation, not even a pause. I stood there for a second, the steam from the mug brushing my face, and typed back one word that tasted sharper than it looked: enjoy. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask, was that I owned a $2 million estate tucked deep in the quiet woods of Vermont, and that this time I wasn't going to spend the holiday waiting for a seat at their table. My name is Anna, and for most of my 33 years, I've carried myself the way my family taught me to: quiet, capable, never needing anything. People say I have a calm presence that I look put together in every room I walk into. What they don't see is how much of that came from learning very early that the louder someone else was, the smaller I had to become. I grew up in a tidy suburban neighborhood just outside Seattle, the kind of place where everyone waved from their driveways, and my mother kept the front porch spotless, as if it proved something. Inside that house, roles were assigned long before I understood what they meant. My mother, Linda, adored my younger brother, Brandon. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. It lived in the way her voice softened around him and sharpened with me. My father, Warren, wasn't cruel, just steady in a way that never bent in my direction. He praised hard work, but somehow my work never counted. I remember being 8 years old, cleaning the kitchen after dinner while Mom rushed Brandon to football practice. I remember bringing his missed assignments to school when he got suspended for fighting. I remember calling for help the night I found him collapsed and shaking from something he never should have touched. I can still hear Mom's voice trembling, angry, asking me why I made everything worse. Meanwhile, Brandon returned from rehab to a backyard full of balloons, neighbors, and a banner welcoming him home. When I got into a prestigious college at 17, Mom set banana bread on the counter and said, "It's quiet, just how you like it." I used to think that was normal, that if I worked hard enough, stayed calm enough, they'd eventually see me. But recognition in my family was a spotlight that moved only when Brandon moved. Years later, when I got engaged, that pattern played out again. Mom asked me to move the date because it overlapped with Brandon's birthday. And at the engagement party, he showed up 2 hours late, blasting loud music, dragging all attention with him like a magnet. I remember the look on my fiancé's face, confused, disappointed. He didn't last long after that. Neither did the version of me who kept insisting everything was fine. Thanksgiving last year was the final hint I refused to accept. I brought someone new, Julian, a general history teacher who asked about my dreams more than my schedule. Mom seated us at a side table for convenience, even though there were empty chairs at the main one. When I shared that I'd bought my first home, Dad nodded vaguely and immediately asked Brandon about his podcast plans instead. It was the moment Julian looked at me as if to say, "You don't deserve this," and I realized he was right. But the truth is, patterns don't break until something snaps hard enough. And this year, that snap arrived in the form of a text message telling me Thanksgiving belonged to my sister's family. A sister I don't even have, just an easier way for Mom to write, "Not you." I reread Mom's text 3 times before setting my phone down. The words didn't hurt the way they used to. They landed with a dull clarity, like something I'd seen coming for years, but only now recognized for what it really was. A line drawn without hesitation. A door closed without apology. I thought back to the Thanksgiving before the one with Julian. We'd arrived early, holding 2 bottles of wine he'd saved for weeks. Mom greeted him with a polite smile and pointed us to a side table near the window. The main table's already arranged, she said, even though 2 chairs sat visibly empty. I remember Julian leaning closer, whispering, "Why does it feel like we're guests at someone else's event?" I didn't answer because admitting it out loud meant admitting how normal it had become. Later that night, when I mentioned the house I'd just bought, a quiet 3-bedroom near the park, Dad nodded but immediately turned to Brandon, asking how his podcast equipment fund was going. "We'll figure it out," he said warmly, as if I hadn't spoken at all. I felt Julian's hand tense on the back of my chair. A few days after he told me he cared about me but couldn't watch me keep shrinking to fit inside someone else's comfort. He left a note on my counter and walked out of my life as gently as he'd walked in. I told myself I'd learned something from that I'd stop chasing permission. But habits built young cling like damp cloth. I still called home every week, still asked if Brandon was doing okay, still swallowed the sting each time they ended the call with "Don't forget to wish him a happy birthday." So when Mom sent that message, "This year, just your sister's family," I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even ask why. I just stood in my kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint Seattle rain against the window, and felt something subtle unspool inside me. The version of me who always understood, always adjusted, always made room, quietly stepped aside. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. I stepped out onto my balcony, mug in hand, watching thin Seattle rain drift sideways across the sky. The phone lay face down on the counter behind me. I didn't need to look at it again. Those 11 words had already done their job. They had finally cleanly separated what I'd feared losing from what had never truly been mine. For a long moment, I just breathed. Then I walked back inside, opened my laptop, and typed a familiar phrase into the search bar: Property Papers, Haven House. The file came up instantly. My name, my signature, my grandfather Harold's steady handwriting on the transfer documents. A $2 million estate sitting in the quiet woods of Vermont, wrapped in pine trees and early snow, legally and irrevocably mine. They never asked about it. They never noticed the annual taxes I paid, never asked why I disappeared for weekends in winter, never wondered what kept drawing me back to a place so far from Seattle. To them, it was just Grandpa's old cabin. To me, it was the only place I'd ever felt unmistakably seen. I stared at the map for a long time. Tiny Blue Lake, winding road, the long rectangle of the house tucked behind a tree line. And then the thought came steady and whole. I don't need their table. I can build my own. I opened a blank document and typed guest list. The first name was Aunt Helen. She'd always pulled me into tight hugs at family gatherings, whispering, "You okay, honey?" even when no one else noticed anything was wrong. Her reply came within minutes. "Tell me the date. I'm already packing." Next was Ethan, my cousin. We hardly talked these days, but when Brandon had one of his meltdowns years ago, Ethan was the only person who muttered, "I'm sorry. You always have to fix everything." When I called, he laughed softly and said Thanksgiving without the drama, count me in. Then Monica, my anchor, my friend who showed up with tea and blankets the night Julian left. When I sent the invitation, she didn't ask a single question. She just replied with a screenshot of her booked flight, choosing joy this year. Finally, I hesitated over one named Ellie, my 8-year-old niece, Brandon's daughter, the only child who ever looked at me like I was more than the family fixer. I typed a simple message to her mother, Amanda, not expecting much. Amanda called within the hour. "Ellie read your message," she said, voice soft. She cried happy tears. She wants to go. And if it's okay, I'd like to come too. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of that settle into my chest. "Of course," I said. "There's room for both of you." That night, I packed a suitcase and booked a flight to Vermont. For years, I'd waited for someone to save me a seat. This time, I was building the whole table myself. I arrived at Haven House 3 days before Thanksgiving, dragging 2 suitcases up the stone steps as the cold Vermont air stung my cheeks. The house looked exactly as it had in every memory, its pine-lined path, its weathered porch, its quiet dignity. For a moment, I just stood there listening to the wind ripple through the trees, feeling something inside me finally settle. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and winter dust. I lit a fire in the stone hearth, watched the flames catch, and let the warmth reach the places that had felt frozen for years. This house had always held me gently even when no one else did. The next morning, I began preparing. I cleared the guest rooms, swept the porch, and laid a white cloth across the long dining table facing the windows. One table only. No side seating. No hierarchy. Everyone would belong equally. That thought alone steadied me. By afternoon, tires crunched over the gravel driveway. Aunt Helen stepped out with a pie tin and a wide scarf blowing behind her. "Sweet girl," she said, pulling me close, "your grandpa would be so proud." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ethan arrived next with wine and a bag of dried flowers. "Thought you might want these," he said with a shy, almost apologetic smile. It felt like a wordless acknowledgement of everything he'd seen and everything he hadn't said. Monica's flight was delayed, but she burst through the door at sunset like a gust of energy. "I brought cheese. 0 idea what it pairs with. We'll wing it." I laughed harder than I had in months. By nightfall, Haven House felt lived in again, coats hanging on chairs, murmured conversations drifting through the rooms, the low hum of people who cared simply because they chose to. It was a warmth I hadn't known how to allow myself before. The next morning, as I sliced apples in the kitchen, I heard small footsteps behind me. Aunt Anna Ellie stood there in her puffy jacket holding a crayon drawing of the house. Amanda followed her in cautious but kind. "You really made it," I said, kneeling. Ellie hugged me tightly. "Mom said we could come because you're making a real Thanksgiving." Amanda gave a soft, tired smile. She's blunt, but she's right. I showed them the attic room with the round window and the wool blankets my grandfather saved for winter storms. Ellie gasped at the view. "It looks like a snow globe." Exactly what he used to say. As we walked back down the stairs, headlights swept across the front windows. I frowned. Everyone I invited was already here. The car door opened and there he was. Dean, tall, steady, wearing a dark coat and holding a folded piece of paper. My breath caught. "I didn't send you an invite," I said quietly. "I know," he replied, handing me the paper. Inside was a child's handwriting, "Uncle Dean come to Vermont. Aunt Anna needs someone who stays." "She wrote this," I whispered. He nodded. "When an 8-year-old tells you someone needs you, you don't ignore it." I stepped aside. "Come in." He walked in slowly, the warmth of the house swallowing the cold from his clothes. No one questioned his presence. They simply made room, a small miracle in itself. Thanksgiving morning looked like something from a movie, snow drifting in lazy circles, the lake half frozen, the house alive with laughter. Monica danced between the stove and counter with jazz music playing. Ethan and Ellie folded napkins into swans. Aunt Helen hovered over the oven as if guarding gold. Even Amanda laughed, really laughed at something Monica said about airline pretzels. Dean sat by the fire carving a small piece of wood, looking up now and then as if checking whether I still needed support. By early afternoon, the house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, brown butter, comfort made visible. For the first time in years, I felt full before the meal even began. We took a group photo by the big window. Ellie slipped her hand into mine at the last second. Someone posted the photo in a group thread with a few distant relatives. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. The calls wouldn't stop. I didn't need to check the screen. I knew exactly who it was. Mom, Dad, probably even Brandon. They'd seen the photo. They knew everyone else was here. They recognized Haven House. And they weren't in it. Monica raised an eyebrow. "Answer it. You've earned this moment." My hand didn't shake as I hit speaker. Linda's voice burst through instantly. "Anna." "What is going on? Why is everyone in Vermont? Whose house is that?" I leaned against the counter. It's mine. A long, stunned silence. Then Dad, don't be ridiculous. It's the family estate. It was, I corrected. Grandpa signed it over to me. Years ago. Mom's voice sharpened. So you excluded us. After everything we've done. You excluded me first, I said calmly. Your text made that pretty clear. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. I continued, voice steady. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm choosing myself. For once. Dean rose from his seat, walked to my side, and gently touched my shoulder. Then he took the phone from my hand. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, he said evenly. Anna is with people who choose her. If that bothers you, maybe think about why. Neither of my parents had an answer, just breathing the kind that carries years of entitlement cracking. Finally, Dad muttered, "We're driving up." "Then drive safe," I said, and ended the call. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then Ethan let out a low whistle. That was something. Aunt Helen cupped my cheek with a proud, trembling hand. "About time, sweetheart." Ellie tugged my sleeve. "Are you okay?" I kneeled to meet her eyes. "Yes," I said softly. "For the first time, I really am." Dinner that night felt like a holiday built from the ground up, warm, chosen free. The turkey was carved imperfectly. The mashed potatoes were lumpy. Someone spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth. But the laughter was real. The peace, honest. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for someone else's disappointment. The table was full, and it was mine. The next morning, snow covered the front steps in a thin white layer. I was helping Ellie draw a wreath design for the door when a long, sharp ring echoed through the house. Monica peeked out the window, then looked back at me. "They're here." I stood smoothing my sweater and opened the front door. My parents stood on the porch, coats buttoned to their chins, faces, pale eyes scanning everything behind me as if searching for the version of me they still expected to control. Anna, my mother, said tightly, "We need to talk. Privately." I led them into my grandfather's study where the afternoon light fell across the old desk. The room felt like a witness. "You blindsided us," my father started. "No," I said calmly, opening a folder and placing the property papers on the desk. I stopped pretending. I told them everything I had swallowed for 30 years, every dismissal, every shifted spotlight, every moment I'd been asked to step aside. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply put truth on the table and let it sit there. For once, they had nothing to lean on, just silence, and the realization that the boundaries were real now. That evening, after the confrontation settled into the quiet corners of the house, we gathered around the long table, my chosen family, the people who showed up. Ellie placed her crayon drawing in the center, all of us standing in front of Haven House smiling. No hierarchy, no missing chairs. As I looked around, I felt something loosen in my chest, something old finally leaving. I wasn't reclaiming a seat at their table. I was building my own. If you've ever had to draw your own boundary or choose peace over permission, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments and subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories about rising, choosing, and becoming whole again.